Well, hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Monica Wedlock Kilpatrick, and I serve as the Vice President of Organizational and Leadership Development for the National Benevolent Association of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Today is a special webinar for many reasons. We have an outstanding panel of mental health professionals who will be engaging in a very relevant and timely conversation together. And joining me as co-host for this webinar is Mark Anderson, our MBA President and CEO. Mark himself is trained in social work and with extensive experience in social services and health and mental health for those living with HIV and AIDS. As a staff person with the Ronald McDonald House Charities, which provides temporary housing for children and families receiving medical treatment, he understands the impact of trauma and crisis on people's immediate and long-term mental well-being. In general, I'm excited and grateful for the minds and hearts gathered today for this time of dialogue and sharing.
Monica, thank you for that very warm introduction and for the many ways that you provide incredible leadership to our MBA programs and the wider church. Greetings to our esteemed panelists. Thank you for your willingness and commitment to be a part of today's webinar. And greetings to our attendees. We look forward to your chats, questions, and comments, as well as engagement. And for all the staff in the background, helping make the technology run well and promoting this most important topic of mental health and well-being, I am truly grateful for all the planning and efforts that brought us together today. Serving as one of the general ministries of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, I am humbled and grateful to lead the MBA in this, our 134th year. Our vision statement is to create communities of compassion and care. And I like to think that while the 6 women in St. Louis who initiated this grand vision so many years ago, they may not understand our virtual platforms like Zoom or ways that technology supports our work today, they would indeed recognize the transformative spirit and courageous compassion of our partner ministries and leaders with health and social service organizations, as well as the MBA commitment to community engagement and advocacy. All of MBA's work is grounded in this vision of creating communities of compassion and care that centers mental health and wellness, justice, and equity.
I mentioned earlier that today is truly a special webinar because this is the first of many events that is helping to celebrate and honor Mark's 10 years of service and leadership with MBA. That's right, folks, Mark is 10 years old. Truly though, back in 2011, when Mark was called to serve as president and CEO, there was much visioning, hard work, and collaborative efforts by so many that brings us to the MBA of today. At the end of our webinar, we will have a bit more to say about Mark, and we'll have an invitation for you to support this work through the MBA Mark D. Anderson Fund. Thank you, Mark, for being part of this important conversation on mental health and wellness. As you may know, today's topic is hope and healing, tending to our spiritual and mental well-being after crisis and trauma. Following a season of health pandemics, social isolation, economic instabilities caused by shutdowns, and the social justice unrest of acts of violence and racism, there is a great need of healing in communities everywhere. As part of MBA's Mental Health and Wellness Initiative, we are joined by Disciples mental health professionals as they speak to the importance of tending to our mental health and wellness, especially in these days that we are returning to social gatherings beyond family or even worshiping in person again. For this webinar, community and church leaders will come away with useful resources for mental wellness, as well as some hopeful inspiration for the everyday. This webinar is being recorded and can be used as a tool for discussion and a resource in your local communities, congregations, regions, and even general church ministries. At the end of the presentation portion, we will try to make time for questions. Throughout the webinar, if you have questions that emerge, we welcome you to use the Q&A feature by clicking on the icon at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions. Please include your email address so that if we are unable to get to your question, we can follow up with you directly after the webinar is over. To request technical assistance, you may also use the Q&A feature. Again, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available for future viewing on the MBA website in the coming weeks. Thank you for joining the discussion.
So before I share about the professional skills and expertise of our amazing panelists, one of the things that I was thinking about in preparation for this webinar was about timeliness and significance. I think it's important that mental health professionals and leaders are thinking about this topic and sharing insights for and with people to consider, especially for church and community leaders who are dealing with increased situations of crisis or loss, or both, from these past several months. As the MBA, we know that we do not have the superpowers to fix all of the stigmas, traumas, and crises happening with our friends and loved ones. Our work today and beyond is about offering access to the skills we can share and equip others. At this time, I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers. Excuse me. Reverend Dr. Heather Honeycutt is a licensed professional counselor at Evergreen Counseling and Consulting in Blakesley, Pennsylvania. Heather is an ordained disciples clergy and pastor of Salem United Church of Christ in Pocono Pines, Pennsylvania. Heather recently earned her Doctor of Theology degree from Evangelical Theological Seminary. Heather served as one of the visionaries for the Georgia Regional Mental Health Initiative in partnership with MBA, and currently serves as facilitator for the MBA Mental Health Equity Cohort. Reverend Cisa Payuyo is the Associate Director of Church Relations at Chapman University in Orange, California, where she has served for the past 18 years. She has ordained clergy in the Disciples of Christ and serves as a spiritual mentor to UCC and disciples-related students through the Disciples on Campus program. Cisa also serves as one of the chaplains for the whole university at Chapman. Cisa is a member of the Pro-Reconciliation and Anti-Racism Committee for the Disciples Pacific Southwest region and has been an anti-racism trainer for the past 5 years. Reverend Anita Adams is a licensed marriage and family therapist and an American Association in Marriage and Family Therapy approved supervisor. She is the clinical service coordinator for Indianapolis Healthy Start. Anita provides support, supervision, and consultation to the staff and clients of Indianapolis Healthy Start as it relates to behavioral and mental health services. She is deeply committed to incorporating social justice and activism into her clinical work. In addition, Nita is also an ordained clergy and Disciples of Christ and has a small private practice ministry where she is mostly providing clinical supervision for therapists. Anita is working on her PhD in philanthropy with a minor in social work. And Anita is also part of the MBA Mental Health Equity Cohort. Our last panelist couldn't be with us today, but I wanted to give his bio, and you'll see the link that'll pop up in the chat feature as well, is Reverend Lee Ivey. He is a therapist resident at the Counseling Center at Christian Theological Seminary and staff therapist at the Martin Luther King Community Center, both in Indianapolis, Indiana, where he facilitates direct clinical services to individuals, couples, families, and groups. He is an active member of the American Counseling Association, Association for Spiritual, Ethical, and Religious Values, and the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development. He also serves as the legislative chair for the Indiana Counseling Association. Lee is ordained in Disciples of Christ, serving Light of the World Christian Church. Lee is also a part of the MBA Mental Health Equity Cohort. So welcome to our panelists. I want to thank you for joining this discussion. We are going to move through a series of questions, and I'm going to invite each panelist to share your perspective and context, your experience, learnings, and wisdom. And a reminder to our audience, you folks that are listening, you can share your comments and questions using the Q&A feature in your menu bar. And we will hold a question and answer session after this first part of the conversation. So let us begin. Zisa, I'm going to start with you with this question. So share a little bit about your context during this pandemic, your profession, location, social context. Please share with us.
Sure. Like Mark mentioned in his introduction of me, I work at Chapman University, where I'm a chaplain there, and students have been lonely, not just students, but faculty and staff as well. When the pandemic broke out, everybody went home, and there was a lot of isolation. So it was good to be able to reach out to students, whether it was by text or by phone or by Zoom calls. That has been just life-giving both ways for both the students and myself. I'm a Filipino American, and my Filipino community in Southern California has been important to me too. Through webinars and through just chats, we've been able to talk about what sustains us as kapwa. Kapwa is the Filipino word for being together in community. Webinars such as that have been really helpful, and I've led a few myself. And then the most beautiful thing through this whole pandemic is that my grandson was born in the midst of this pandemic. He brings so much joy and so much hope, so much hope.
Thanks, Zisa. Anita, I'm going to come to you with that same question.
So really my location during this whole pandemic has been like a lot of parents, and I'm a single parent, juggling, dealing with kids' schedules and online learning and clients from home and supervision sessions from home, and doing all of that while also pursuing a PhD. So just a lot of juggling and just complete and total Zoom burnout. So really trying to take care of myself while also taking care of others. Most of, as it was stated earlier, a lot of supervision that I've provided to frontline service workers who have both been in public health, but also in mental health throughout the pandemic. So me trying to support and encourage other people to take care of themselves while I'm also supporting and encouraging myself and taking care of myself. So one of my spiritual practices was just at the end of the day, shutting my computer off and going for a walk, just decompressing and finding joy and peace and happiness in nature, and just trying to get centered. Because I can't give what I don't have. So being able to really find those practices both in the morning and the day, at the end of the day, kind of like bookends to kind of get myself grounded for the work in, during the actual day. And so like many people throughout the world, just juggling a lot and just on the computer too much, and kids on the computer too much, but, just doing the best that we can with this season of life.
Thank you. And Heather.
Yeah, I've been bivocational during this pandemic period. So I'm 3/4 time pastor at a church. I also have my counseling practice where I specialize in complex trauma. In addition, I, like Anita, am a single parent. And so I have 5 kids ranging from 16 to 8. So schooling at home and everybody doing everything at home. When the pandemic started, I was in the last semester, and then in the fall and spring my dissertation. So the rest of my doctoral, grateful that we've all made it here.
Great. Heather, we had a little problem with your answer because of some Wi-Fi issue maybe, so we'll move on, but let's see if that gets resolved. So the next question, as clergy and other church leaders were tending to others' needs during this pandemic, we recognize that these individuals, you all, were dealing with your own responses during the season of crisis, including grief, loss, fear, numbing, trauma, and so much more. So to you panelists, what has been your internal reaction to an experience of the pandemic? And maybe what role has trauma played in your reaction as well? So Heather, I'm going to come and start with you first, so you can give us some shared language around trauma. And then please feel free to answer the question as well.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop my video and see if that helps with our internet for this moment. But I'm still here, I promise. So to define trauma kind of broadly, simply put, it's any experience that exceeds our ability to cope, right? So in the immediate aftermath of trauma, we may experience symptoms like shock and denial, and some longer term symptoms include flashbacks, somatic symptoms, which means things that are going on in our body with no organic cause, and emotional dysregulation. And we can have big T traumas, what we call in the field big T traumas, like death, violence, or natural disaster, and little T traumas like emotional abuse, neglect, the loss of relationships. And so trauma is a big word that has a lot of meanings, but generally speaking, we mean anything that exceeds our ability to cope. And I will say for myself, I felt afraid. And because when I feel afraid, I tend to reach for control, which manifests most often as overwork. So you may not have heard what I said in my intro that, during the pandemic period, I was pastoring a church, maintaining my clinical practice, finishing my dissertation, and schooling 5 kids at home. That's too much, and we all knew it. But like most pastors, overwork is my go-to. But also the uncertainty piece. Am I making the right choices in pastoring my congregation? Am I making the right choices for my kids, for my clients? Even when I think I'm doing the right thing, somebody's going to be angry, right? So just a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear were the kind of overarching emotions that I experienced during this pandemic period. And I will say, still feel to some degree during this pandemic period. My kids aren't vaccinated yet. What can we do? What can't we do? Some of the church is unhappy about some of the protocols we still have in place. What do we do? What do we not do? So those are, I would say, the overarching characteristics of my response.
Thanks, Heather. And you came through loud and clear, so thanks so much for that. Cecil, we're going to turn to you, and then after Cecil and Nita, you can jump right in.
Thank you. Much like Heather, I was also scared for the world, and I'd go from the world to the US to California, to Southern California, to my own neighborhood. Are we doing the right things? Am I sanitizing enough? And I'm an older person with, with diabetes. How is that going to affect me going out? Should I go out? Should I not go out? And these were just daily questions that I'd ask, and looking for answers, looking for support was always my first go-to. When there was a surge in hate crimes and in Asian hate crimes, I would start getting calls from other Asian American women across the country, and just being together and mourning and being scared and just being there for each other was the only hope that we could have at that particular time. Sharing prayers together was just so important, that knowing that somehow through all of this, God is still with us and our faith keeps us going. So these are the things that hit me and my community when the pandemic hit and my reactions to it. Yeah.
And Anita?
So for me, similarly, I think there's a lot of the fear of the unknown and not knowing how to kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, I think up until not knowing, once we had vaccines, it sort of changed, but that long waiting period of not knowing how long are we going to be doing this for, feeling stuck inside, and I'm a pretty extroverted person. I like being in the community. I like going outside. I like connecting. So, just being home all the time, and then that cabin fever is, and that's a different level of exhaustion, not knowing, when are we going to be able to do that? When can we do that? And then, being able to hold that space for your kids to be able to say, we don't know, we are not sure what this is going to look like. But, I think learning how to just live life a little slower was also a huge shift for me, to not always be going. I think for a lot of people, that was the upside of the pandemic, is being able to not have to rush around all the time either. And so I think that has been something that even after all of this is over and I do return to chaotic life at some point, I want to find ways to make sure I'm still, slowing down. And I found a beautiful plaque that says, make sure in the still small moments that you make time for God. Because I think sometimes when we're doing all that rushing, we don't have enough still small moments. And so I think the gift for me in the pandemic was, despite the fear and the uncertainty, all the scary stuff, being able to slow down enough to be able to spiritually reflect in new ways.
Thank you all for that. Your responses remind me that as clergy, as mental health professionals, we are busy tending to the trauma, the crisis of other people. But we also, over the course of this past year and a half, experienced a variety of trauma related to the pandemic, related to the racial injustices that were happening in our country, and how do we tend to those trauma that we experience. So thank you for that answer. So this next question is a tough one. So in your context, what mistakes have you made in this process and during this time of crisis? And what have you learned from them? And when you answer, if you would remind us of your context that you serve in. And Cisa, I'm going to start with you with that question.
Okay. So I work at Chapman University, and when George Floyd passed away, we put on a vigil, and it was well received. And we figured that, vigils will be our way to keep community together. The second one we had was during the insurrection. And from the time of the George Floyd vigil to the time of the insurrection, it was already 6 months. And we were so isolated that we almost forgot how to reach out to others. So when we put together the vigil for to mourn the insurrection, we did it amongst ourselves as chaplains, because the mother hens knew best, and we didn't reach out to students and faculty and staff, and we put it on ourselves because we knew how to do this right, and that was a big mistake. Students knew a lot more information about the insurrection and the way Chapman was involved in it that we didn't know, and it really blew up in our face. And so the third vigil that we had was to mourn anti-Asian hate crimes. And I said, I will take this one on, and definitely called students, faculty, staff to join with me in mourning. And each person, we gave each person a chance to share what they were going through. And afterwards, we would say, we see you, we hear you, we recognize your courage to share your story. So this is what we did wrong, and this is how we made it right.
Yeah, thank you, Cisa. Anita?
I would think, yeah, thank you, Cisa, for that. I think one of the mistakes that I made, especially when, you know, so much was going on and the world was shifting, I think I just kept going for a while and didn't really stop to kind of check in on myself. And a couple months into the pandemic, I just kind of crashed and burned. And I was like, I have got to get back into therapy. And I was like, I was not practicing what I was preaching. And I was just coming to the point where I felt like I was burning a candle at all ends and focused on everybody else. And I really thought, Anita, you know better. Like, how did you end up here again? But you know how easy it is, especially when you're a caregiver and when you're a leader and you're supporting everybody else, to get to this place where you just keep giving. And then you end up one day just exhausted. And that's where I got. And it was a humbling moment for me, but very important for me to really kind of wake back up and say, okay, this is not you. This is not your best version. This is not your best ministry. This is, you've got to kind of slow down. And at that point, that's when I started kind of implementing some more routines and structures, and days off, and just complete mental health days where I was not doing anything, just to get myself back on track, because I could find myself burning out and becoming something that wasn't my best self. And so that was one of those things. I had all the intellectual knowledge and I knew it, but it was a huge mistake to think that somehow I was immune to it, or, you know, I could just keep going. But that the reality is that I'm a human and that I needed to slow down and be able to take care of myself.
Heather, please.
So again, my context is pastor of a local congregation. So I think that there are two major mistakes that we as a congregation made, and one, obviously, I probably made hundreds.
Heather, I'm going to stop you.
I think the mistake that I made.
Heather, I'm going to stop you. Do you mind if you turn off your screen again? I think we'll be able to hear your answer much better.
Okay. So I think the first thing that I did wrong was that I took too much responsibility on myself and did not delegate well to my leaders. They were willing to do things, and I was over responsible and took on too much. I think much like Anita was saying, I didn't sort of focus my time and energy well. I would say the two biggest mistakes we made as a congregation were, first, we weren't creative in how to care for our older adults in the beginning. My older adults who weren't as tech savvy, who had less access to technology and other resources, suffered. And I grieve how they suffered and how I, as their clergy person and my co-leadership, failed them in those early months. I would say our biggest mistake as it related to racial justice was my church asked me if we could do a book study. And so I chose Ijeoma Oluo, So You Want to Talk About Race. We went through, we did a lovely study. I think my congregation responded very well to it. But then at the end, they'd kind of thought, oh, well, we know all there is to know about racism now. And so now we can solve this. And so at some point as the clergy person, I felt like I was banging my head against the wall. Like, did we not understand the structural nature of racism, the systemic, the intertwined, the permeating nature of racism? And so we've continued to do some work, but you know, what that showed me was that no matter how much progress one book study made for us, it certainly wasn't enough, and we needed to redouble our ongoing efforts, just in the right places.
Thanks, Heather, for that reflection. I think, yeah, all your answers kind of hit on a number of highlights related to what's been happening over the past year and a half, which included the health pandemic, but also the focus on racism and the systemic racism here in our country and in Canada, as well as here in the United States, the political unrest that has taken place. And Cisa, you mentioned the insurrection, the uprising that took place at the Capitol on January 6th. So there were many things that were coming together that affected how clergy, mental health professionals were responding, not only to themselves, but also to the needs across their community. I think the piece that I heard in your voices is offering yourself some grace in terms of this time period, and saying we weren't at our best, but this is how we learn from that. So the next question I have for you, because I know you have done stuff, is what have you all done well in this process that you want to be sure to carry forward? And so Cisa, I'm going to start with you again.
Well, at the beginning of the pandemic, nobody was on campus, and nobody can come and drop in and talk with any of the chaplains. And so we created a chat with a chaplain space online where students could make an appointment to chat with us. And it went well at the beginning of the semester, but then as we're getting better, we're not getting as many calls. But it might be something that we will continue as the semester opens up. Definitely small groups, checking in with each other by Zoom, family time even was something that we just started doing, our family fam jam time every week, just checking in by Zoom and seeing how everybody is. We definitely didn't do this pre-pandemic, and we're going to continue to do it, as long as everybody wants to. Like Anita said, I started working out and going on walks, sweaty walks, and just really got the endorphins going, and that just really has helped a lot. We've created, during this pandemic, we've created affinity groups. I get together with not only students of color, but students of faith. So Faithfully Colorful is how we're calling our group. Also during this time, as I mentioned, Asian American women across campus and across the nation have been in contact with me. And so at least for Chapman, we have now an Asian American affinity support group that meets on a regular basis and really have some real good conversations. Throughout this whole time, my sense of the need to decolonize has just been even more heightened. And so I look daily and look for reflections daily of where do I decolonize my thoughts and thinking in whatever it is I see or whatever it is I encounter. And that has almost become a spiritual practice for me. So, and when I say decolonization, that leads to the racism that goes on in the country. Where do I create a space for anti-racism to happen? And that has just been a daily strong reflection for me. And I will continue to do that.
Cisa, thanks. I wonder, could you say just a little bit more about decolonization? That may not be a familiar term for our attendees.
Yes, for me, as a Filipino American, Philippines was colonized 400 years with the Spanish, 50 years with America, and it's taking just all of the American Western thinking to a country and imposing it on the colonized people, and we have taken it as our own. And it allowed us to forget our identity, forget who we are. And the need, when we come into racism, we wonder, why are people against me? But then I realize I've taken on, colonizers thinking so much that I forget who I am. And so remembering my culture, remembering my heritage, remembering what my parents and ancestors did to come here has been part of my decolonizing, has part of been reaching back and reaching into who I am and who my people are, and how we contribute to wherever we are. We've contributed greatly to the United States, and learning how to be proud of that has just been really a daily practice for me. And to be able to share that with people as well.
Lisa, thanks for sharing that with us. I appreciate that. Anita, for you, what are things that you have done well during this season of crisis and want to move forward with things?
So, similar to what I had said previously, I've, learned to slow down. I've learned to be more reflective and to be able to kind of take care of myself in new ways. But I actually wanted to kind of pick up on what Cisa had said also, because, I think so much of how we care for others often is based upon some deeply colonial programming that we all have. I know for me, decolonizing this kind of idea of needing to be the savior for people or needing to, sacrifice myself in unhealthy ways has been a really, even an unconscious process for me, very much deeply rooted in my own upbringing and my own way of how I saw ministry in unhealthy ways of like sacrificing yourself for the greater good, that somehow that was like this great concept to like give what you don't have and to somehow trust God to make up the difference. And a lot of how we help and serve people can sometimes seem really like we have good intentions, but can have really negative impacts, especially when we're doing community work. And so one thing I am working on in my own life and in my own ministry is really looking at my own intentions and making sure that I am putting myself in a position of service and ministry, and decolonizing any sort of unconscious ideas that I have about why I'm doing the work that I'm doing. Because I think oftentimes we can get in these autopilot. And for me, it was very much, how a lot of the ministry that was modeled for me that was very unhealthy and ended up in burnout and exhaustion. And so I'm working very hard on doing my own work and taking care of myself and figuring out how to live and practice what I'm preaching, not through words, but through my life and through my lifestyle, and being able to live love and be able to live grace and mercy and not need to advertise it, not need to talk about it, not need to put it on display, but really being able to preach the gospel through my lifestyle, and less about anything else.
Thanks, Anita. Heather, I'm so sorry that I'm keeping you off screen, but your voice is important. We want to make sure we hear you. So if you would answer the question in terms of what you think that you did well, and that you want to carry it forward.
Absolutely. And y'all couldn't see me just like nodding vigorously, right, as Cisa and Anita spoke. And so I just want to wholeheartedly thank them for the decolonizing work that they have done and continue to do, and that I seek to do myself in an almost entirely white church in a predominantly white area. So I would say the things that we've done well. I'm very fortunate to have a board that is willing to be flexible. So, for example, we have consistently, my church has the backpack program for those kiddos who are food insecure at our local elementary school. Well, when the kids weren't in school for months and months, they weren't able to access those foods because we weren't allowed to come to the school, and neither were the children. And so what did we do? My board voted that it would be okay for us to donate all of those things to the local food pantry, where that was still in operation half a mile away from the church. So these children and their families could have some more security on weekends. And they voted also, when the children went back to school, that we could go back to doing the backpack program. And I'm incredibly grateful, again, for the flexibility and the vision of a board who will say, okay, well, we can't minister in the way that we're accustomed to ministering. So what can ministry look like in this moment? So I would say we did that well. I think one thing that has been really important for me is to become a more trauma-informed pastor, right? I'm a trauma therapist. So you would think that those skills would sort of just transfer naturally to becoming a more trauma-informed pastor. But the reality is, in my church life, I wasn't always as trauma-informed as I could be. You know, of course, when I was preaching on David and Bathsheba, I would say, you know, this is rape. But looking out at the faces in my pews, sometimes I forget that I don't know everything about their lives. And so this pandemic period really has forced me in a beautiful way to become more educated about the way that I interact with those in my congregation, and to be more, have an ear more attuned to the traumas that they're not speaking, but they are living.
Heather, thanks for that. I wonder if I can have a follow-up question with you. A term that may not be familiar with people that aren't trained in trauma. When you say trauma informed with your congregation, can you elaborate a little bit more when you what trauma informed means?
Certainly. So, you know, we do all this learning about trauma and its effects. But one of the problems with trauma education is that it can be very me-centered. It's just like meant to be a skill set, right? So I know how when a person in front of me says, I experienced XYZ trauma, I know how to work with that individually. But what does it mean to create a culture that is trauma informed, right? How do we interact with one another? For example, in a church setting, when we do the passing of the peace, do we just assume it's okay to touch people? Right, so there are myriad places that this could be applied, but to be trauma informed is just look at the world through a set of lenses that says, I don't know what has happened to you. I know the statistics are that more than half of the people in my congregation have experienced some kind of trauma. So how do I behave in a way that keeps everybody as safe as possible? How do I acknowledge when I fail in that? And how do I teach my people to do the same?
Yeah, so helpful. Thank you, Heather. So we have one last question before we're going to open it up to your questions. So to the panelists, and Cisa, I'm going to start with you as well. What resources and tools are you aware of to walk clergy through this season?
Well, I'm going to mention two websites. One is called Hollaback, IHOLLABACK. And this is a people-powered movement to end racism. And they have webinars and trainings on how to be a good bystander intervention, how to look at policies and say where's the harassment going on. Another one is Anti-Racism Daily. This is a daily email that will come in that'll give you articles about racism, about action items that you can do within, on your phone, online, within your community. And they've been really very helpful for me. Again, I connected to my spiritual practice of decolonization. These two sites are really good.
Great, thanks for that, Cisa. And a reminder of folks that all these resources that are being shared, we'll send that as a follow-up to attendees, so you capture all this information. Anita?
Yeah, these are awesome, awesome resources. I'm really excited about them. Can you repeat the question? Because it cut out for me just a little bit.
You bet. What resources and tools are you aware of to walk with clergy and other leaders through this season?
I think there are a lot of resources, and I think a lot of them are through the NBA and the Disciples of Christ that I would be referring people to. So I don't know if I would necessarily have any specific resources outside of what's already been shared. I think that there's a lot of awesome work that's happening both on a national level and in local communities. And so I think that looks a little different in every area that you're working in. But I think, you know, asking those questions and getting connected to people is so important, because this is not the kind of work that we can do alone. We all need each other. And we all need to be connected. And so I'll have to kind of think a little bit more about any specific resources that I would you know, refer people to, but really it would be the NBA probably.
I don't think I paid you a lot of money to say that, but that sounds good, Anita. Heather, how about you?
Yeah, so as a blanket, I typically refer folks to NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. You know, there are a lot of resources there. It's a nice umbrella organization under which you can find specific resources, not only for your area, but also for your situation. For clergy who are interested in mental health, the Interfaith Network on Mental Illness is a great resource. And it is a truly interfaith organization. It's not, you know, just for, you know, Christians and Unitarians, but really truly interfaith. So they can help you know how to help your congregants. They can help you with resources for starting a mental health ministry in your congregation. And I think that's going to be kind of the next big thing in churches, right? Starting mental health ministries in our organizations. I would also say, if you as a clergy person need therapy, there are some clergy specific therapists out there. So please search for those therapists who have experience with the challenges and the joys of ministry. Certainly you can go to any therapist who's qualified, but a clergy specific therapist brings you a level of insight and comfort that would be challenging to find in a clinician who didn't have either some lived experience or at least some deep clinical experience with a clergy population. And so those are the three things I would most strongly recommend: NAMI, Interfaith Network, and clergy-specific counseling.
Great. Two questions back to you, Heather. NAMI, is that website, is that just for mental health professionals, or can a lay leader go and look at their resources and draw upon them?
Yeah, absolutely. NAMI is for everyone, and they have links to support groups all over the country. So anyone who is interested in mental health or who needs some help or training with mental health is absolutely welcome to go to NAMI.org.
Great. And then I don't know if it's a question, but more of a affirmation that as professionals, as ourselves, as clinicians, as clergy, we do not do a good job of seeking out a professional mental health assistance. So just a huge affirmation to your last statement about identifying someone that can help you walk through some of these challenges.
Yes, we tend to put ourselves last and work the most, and then we wonder why we feel so burnt out and exhausted, and why more than a quarter of clergy people considered leaving their posts during the pandemic. It's because we're not great at self-care, and your therapist can help you figure out the reasons for that.
Yes, yes, yes. So this is going to end our presentation portion of today's webinar. But as we transition to answer any questions that have been submitted through the Q&A feature, and if you've not asked a question in the Q&A feature, I would encourage you to do so. And I saw one that popped up here in the chat feature, so we'll grab those and we'll go through those with our panelists. But I want to invite our panelists at this moment to take a minute or two to reflect on anything we have not touched on in our conversation thus far, but needs to be lifted up and or addressed. And I'll just offer that up to any three of you to jump in, no specific order if you want to share something additional.
You know, we did mention, CISA mentioned the impact and the trauma to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in this period. And it is unfortunate that Reverend Ivy is ill today. I did want to notice the fact that we didn't talk as much as we had planned to about the impact on Black communities of racism, of the murder of George Floyd. And we just want you to know that that was our intention, and that we had hoped that someone with lived experience could speak on that. But the fact that we didn't speak on that right now was not due to oversight. It was really just due to the fact that Reverend Ivy is ill today. So please know that it was our intention to do so, and that, you know, it wasn't something we were just leaving out because we were uncomfortable, but rather just a matter of circumstance.
Heather, thanks for sharing that, and most definitely in their follow-up email with participants, we'll gather any resources that Dr. Ivy or the rest of the panelists have that potentially could address this specific issue so that we can encourage folks to go deeper around this work.
I just want to say thank you to my colleagues on this panel, and how they are taking on, how they've said that, you know, they are doing their own work. And I appreciate that greatly. I appreciate it when people do take on their own work of learning about anti-racism, learning about the racism and history in our country, and taking that on. I do it for myself, and I appreciate when others do it too.
And if I could just speak to that, I think it's a life work, right? Like, none of us ever get to the point where we're anti-racist, or that we have arrived at some place of, you know, completely decolonizing our minds. I mean, the reality is, this is, like, I appreciated, Cisa, what you said about this being a spiritual practice, and that this is something that, especially if we are clergy and if we're mental health professionals, and if we're in any helping profession, we have to continually do this work. And so I know for me, as a white therapist, and I spoke yesterday to a group of white therapists being, you know, in a training program, that it's our job to do that work. It's not anybody else's job to teach us about their community or to try to help us to understand their perspective. We have to do the work to educate ourselves. And that's a constant work of constantly looking at ourselves and asking ourselves hard questions, and working with a therapist, and going to seminars, and reading books, and that is a life work that we're all called to do. And it is very much a spiritual practice. And I appreciate you using that language, because I think more of us need to be able to look at how anti-racism work and decolonizing our minds is very much a part of our own ministries as clergy. It's a part of our call. It's a part of our spiritual witness.
Yes to all of that. Thank you. So it's definitely not a one book read, one book club, and it's a done process, right? It's a lifetime journey. So thank you for all three of you responding to that. I do want to turn our attention to some questions. These are surprise questions that you don't know what they are. And you all can answer how you want. You all three don't need to answer a question. So as you feel called, feel free to jump in. So we touched a little bit about this, Cisa, when you had mentioned the term decolonizing, but let's see if there's other conversation we want to have about this. The terms colonizing and decolonizing are unfamiliar to some. Would you please say more about what this means?
Well, colonizing is we're here in the United States. It's America coming and just taking over the land from the Native Americans and just becoming very dominant in the country and saying that their way is the best way, their way is the only way. Without recognizing that there have been cultures that have existed for a long time, in the United States that are very rich, and saying that, the Western culture is the best and the most dominant. When people of color stand up and say, no, I have my own culture as well that is of value and that everyone can learn from it as well. It's kind of leveling out the playing field and saying that, we are all God's children, and that, white people are not just better God's children than people of color. It's a matter of equity and relearning history, relearning the narrative of the indigenous people. That's part of decolonizing and really learning how to humble ourselves or lift ourselves up. So we can also decolonize our policies. We can also decolonize, as Anita was saying, how do we look at the way we teach or the way we lead ministry, where it's been really white dominant? How do we learn to humble ourselves and be able to invite other stories, invite other narratives into a space, invite other ways of learning into a space, invite other ways of doing liturgy into a space? It's all, for me, I find decolonizing in so many aspects of life.
Thanks, Cisa. Heather or Anita, either one of you want to jump in there?
So if I could share a definition, I actually recently read an article and I really like this definition. It says colonization is the term used to understand the legacy of generations of European economic and government expansion throughout most of the world. And as a result, Europeans attempt to control, exploit, and subjugate indigenous people. Therefore, to decolonize means to dismantle this system deeply embedded into the fabric of our society. And I took that from an article. It was actually called Decolonizing in Social Work, Education, and Practice by Tamburo, Tambur. I could put that in the chat, but I really like this definition because I think, to Cisa's point, part of this concept of why we need to decolonize is because this is so deeply embedded in us. And I think part of my own work as a therapist and as a helper is not assuming that I know the answers to other people's problems, or trying to think that somehow because I have more education or more knowledge on a specific topic, that somehow, especially when people come to me for support, that I am in a position of not knowing and that I can dismantle my own assumptions to be able to make space for understanding and really being able to learn from others in collaborative ways. And that's very much recognizing that there's God in each and every one of us, and that I do not have some universal truth, or I can save other people with my somehow gospel message, or that I somehow know what other people need to do with their lives, but that I can be in this space of not knowing and create true, meaningful conversation and connection and collaboration in ways that feels really authentic. And that's the work of being able to recognize that this system is deeply embedded in every facet of our lives. So just to Cisa's point, do we do some of the things that we do? And are we just doing it because it's always been done that way? Or is there another way that's maybe more collaborative and maybe promotes healing in new ways?
Heather, not seeing your face, if you're nodding or you want to jump in, I'm going to move to the next question.
Great.
Great. So thank you all for that. That's an incredible conversation, and is a conversation that I look forward to MBA hosting another webinar specifically around these topics. So thank you. This is some affirmation from one of the attendees. This is a great discussion, and they are grateful to each of you. So when we think about trauma and crisis, what is the role that empathy can offer to us in our own ongoing work of healing and being attentive? Sometimes there's a real tension about addressing our own needs and also being socially aware of how others are being impacted in these times of crisis. So maybe do a lot reflecting on what empathy can offer up to us.
I think empathy can be a double-edged sword. Because I think it can drive us toward really good and holy and beautiful work when we recognize the humanity in another person and we feel with them, right? We feel, certainly we can't have their same interior experience, but we can imagine what it would be like. You know, I once read that there are two camps of people who say, I can't even imagine. One is people who can't imagine and won't put themselves in that position. And the other is they're absolutely imagining a fully fleshed out scenario in which they were experiencing the same thing. And I think that sort of highlights the edges, right, of empathy. But if we're not careful, it can be debilitating. It can lead us to do nothing because we are so overwhelmed with feeling that we become paralyzed and cannot then act. And I think that there's this beautiful space where we feel with and then we are empowered to do something, where empathy can be our drive, it can be our energy, it can carry us through when nothing else does or seems to. But we have to be careful about finding a balance of empathic feeling and empathic action.
Can I make one comment on that, Heather? It's not just the empathy in terms of how we are empowered as professionals, but the empathy, our empathy that we're engaging in should be in empowering the person that we're in relationship with, right? That they feel empowered.
Absolutely. And thank you for lifting that up. Again, that's those of us who are caregivers, we can slip into that space where we think we have to do the thing and that we know the best thing. And no one's experience is normative, right? So I thank you for saying that.
I mentioned earlier in Filipino culture, there's a word called kapwa, K-A-P-W-A. And the way to explain it is kind of through the golden rule +1. So we say, love your neighbor as you love yourself, because your neighbor is yourself. And so using this mantra when I come in conversation with students, you know, I am able to see I try my best to hear and see and where, we align or where I can learn from a person in order to help them.
Let me jump into another question. Are there resources with best practices for churches to apply trauma-informed lenses in their worship? And you may need to think about this, and it may be something that goes in our follow-up email, but is there something that clergy working with their congregations or lay leaders working with their congregations can help apply this trauma-informed lens?
Absolutely. And I can send out some more specific resources via email, but one just to get everybody started is traumainformedchurches.org. And again, it's just kind of an umbrella, a starting point. And then there are some resources I used in my dissertation, the bibliographic information for which we can send later.
Great, thank you on that, Heather. Anyone else want to respond to that before we jump to the next question? So what do you say to people that think there's an end date to healing, especially as we continue to engage more fully and publicly in the world? As you know, these things have shifted some, but we're not out of the woods with anything, right? There's sometimes a stigma and misperception that mental health and wellness does not need to be continuous.
I can definitely speak to that. I mean, I think, healing is an ongoing journey. You certainly can't tell somebody who's lost a child that they ever heal from that. I mean, when you've when you've dealt with certain traumas of loss and grief and tragedy, there's going to be kind of cycles to grief. So there are going to be periods in which, you're okay. And it seems like, things are going in an okay direction. You're getting healing, but then there could be triggers or things that take you right back to that place. And so for when we're talking about grief and loss, there's never a time where you're completely healed. I mean, there are times that, yes, you absolutely can get healing and be fully restored, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to have certain things that remind you of your loss. There's not going to be certain triggers that take you back to your loss. So even the thought that, everybody gets completely healed from something isn't really very realistic. And I think when we kind of set up this expectation that somehow you're going to be completely healed, sometimes our healing is also connected to the pains that we've been through. And so we have to honor that that's a part of our story as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a constant journey, I guess, is what I'm saying, is sort of the takeaway is that, healing looks different for every single person, in a physical sense, an emotional sense, and a spiritual sense. And so it's never helpful to compare one person's journey to somebody else's journey, because it looks different for every single person.
I agree with you, Anita. I think people are thinking that they want things to go back to normal. It's going to be a new normal. And healing is a big part of that. And just a daily path of walking that path of healing yourself and being a healer to others is so important. And it doesn't end, till we leave this world.
I love that term, Sisa, of a new normal, because the reality is we're never going to go back to what life it was before
Right.
the pandemic, and in some ways, some new creativity and some new connections have emerged as a result of the pandemic. And we want to hold on to those as well and be able to recognize that there's a lot of work to be done, and some of the things that have emerged are not healthy things that need a lot of attention, energy, and healing. And so there's a lot of work to be done in that process. And we have to find the new normal and continually strive for that healing. But it's never going to look like what we used to have before. And I think it's important for us to be honest about that, is that our world has shifted and we've all shifted. We're not in the same place now than we were a year and a half ago.
Absolutely. Over the July 4th weekend, my family and I got together with friends. It's like, we were all vaccinated. We didn't wear masks. We were still a very small group, but we shared COVID stories. We shared our pandemic stories. And that just felt like a healing circle of hearing each other. And recognizing that we've all gone through so much. And so things like that, to be able to open up to do things like that is going to be part of our healing.
Yeah,
Sharing
Teresa,
narratives, sharing stories. Yeah, I'm sorry.
no, you're fine. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I read an article this morning that said every death averages 9 grievers. So if we've lost 600,000 Americans, that's 5 million grievers, right? A little over. And, I think the most important thing to remember about trauma is that the symptoms don't always show up right away. So we're in this for the long haul. You want to talk about a new normal, grieving will be a significant part of our new normal. So how do we, as clergy community leaders, how do we make space for grief? How do we make space for lament? Can we get back to biblical lament practices in ways that are contextually appropriate?
Yes.
And so I think that in this space, the church has a real opportunity to create and hold healing space for people simply to do their grief work and let God meet them there, facilitated by us, right? And not just our training, but our sense of empathy, our sense of community, our sense of deep care, and give them permission.
Heather, we just knocked out your last voice there, but thank you. That was a great response, all three of you. This next question, we have some questions coming in fast and furious. I don't know if we're going to get to them all. This next question, though, I think kind of dovetails the last responses that you've given. What are some specific steps you would recommend for congregation members who seem to experience an ability to begin to step back into community, for example, in-person worship, as the public restrictions are being lifted? We have some members of our community who'd appear to be stuck in the lockdown mode and continue to restrict their interaction despite being fully vaccinated themselves. How do we help find a new comfort level for congregants?
Well, just thinking off the top of my head, I think definitely the churches who have met through Zoom or YouTube would continue to do that, but then also show that people are coming back into the sanctuary, that things are going on in the sanctuary, that people are meeting and it's okay. And then definitely reaching out to the folks that, might be afraid and just really talking with them, just listening to them. Maybe even try to meet with them in person if they're okay with that. And just, it's going to be a slow process in getting folks back in. But, we have to move at the speed of trust.
We have to move at the speed of trust. Thank you for that.
I love that, Cisa. And I think part of how do we move at the speed of trust is it takes time to build trust.
Yes.
And it's not a fast process. And so it takes a lot of listening and reflection. And just to speak to your point, I think, exploring what are people afraid of and being able to hold space for that without judgment, that everybody has a different fear level, and people need to be able to speak to that and say what they're feeling and feel listened and not feel like they're being judged or pushed to do something too soon, but to be able to create the space for people to be able to express themselves so that they can build the trust with the process. And that's a very slow relational process. But that's also ministry. And so how do we hold the space to be able to allow people to do what feels comfortable to them, and let that trust slowly build back up again.
Absolutely. I would echo what my co-panelists have said. And I would say, don't push, but do invite, right? Continually invite folks to come back. And just remember that we don't know every bit of their context. We may know, the person, but we may not know their family. We may not know the risk level of the people around them. I have small children, some of whom are unvaccinated. And so my children are not back in church. I am fully vaccinated and am back in church. But risk is relative. And so we expected this sort of mass return, this sort of jubilee. And I think what we've seen is this kind of cold and broken hallelujah for folks who have come back. And I think it's going to continue in that vein. It'll be a slow trickle rather than a raging stream.
Yeah, back to whatever this new normal is, right? Heather, you made the comment there of continually invite. And I love that concept. I think that all too often or I'll say myself, that I've asked you once or twice, maybe 3 times, I'm just going to stop asking, right? But I think it's our role to continually invite, because we don't know when that time is for them that they're saying, yes, I can do this, and re-engage back with the community in a more fuller way.
Absolutely.
Okay. We may have time for one more question, and this may have to go into resources as well. Monica, am I done, or do I have time for one more question? One more question, okay. My spouse and I facilitate clergy communities of practice. They are ordained clergy. They're not trained therapists, but are simply believers in a model for support, accountability, and growth. What resources, books, articles, podcasts, videos, etc., would you recommend to strengthen our efforts to support one another's wellness and hold one another accountable to seeking care and correction when needed? So I love that. They identify as ordained clergy. They recognize they're not therapists, but it is this coming together as peers and how they support and hold each other accountable.
One of my colleagues might be better suited to answer in terms of specific resources, but the 2 things I would say is, number 1, you have skills, we know, because you're ordained clergy and you're already leading a community of practice. So we know that you have the skills to do this. And so you can lean into those skills, right? You can lean into that. And you can also lean into the group's wisdom and the Spirit moving among you, because while we sometimes fail, our goal is to fail forward. And so when you can lean into the established community and the wisdom inherent therein, some of these things will emerge organically.
I think, well, the NBA would be definitely be a place to look for support and help. Also, I think if you can get together with a group of other clergy and to talk about how do we support each other, or even sharing best practices amongst each other. You can contact your region and see if, other clergy in your area would be willing to get together. Your region might have resources as well.
Well, I am going to end this portion of our time together. I want to thanks so much to our speakers. We are blessed by the work and honored by your presence here today. And to our audience, in the chat box, you'll find links to their websites so you can visit and learn more about how their ministries are creating communities of compassion and care that center mental health and wellness, justice, and equity. And for additional resources and support, we invite you to visit our website, mbacares.org, for more educational and worship service resources, as well as soul care wellness activities. You may also visit our denominational website, disciples.org, for clergy resources for crisis and trauma. And another way you can be involved and stay informed of our work at MBA is to sign up for our newsletter at mbacares.org/newsletter. There are a few checkboxes you can mark to let us know you're interested in mental health and wellness. And Monica, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, Mark, thank you for sharing some of the resources available to our audience. I'm also reminded that some of the best resources are human resources and relationships. And so we each have those in our community. You have these new faces and names from our panelists and the work that they're doing, and we invite you to be connected. And I'm delighted to share that MBA has identified a new staff leader, Jocelyn Spence, whose picture will pop up soon, who began on June 28th of this year as MBA's Director of Mental Health and Wellness Initiative. Welcome, Jocelyn. Jocelyn comes to MBA with a wealth of experience and passion for mental health care, holistic and communal wellness, and faith, making her well-suited to deepen and expand MBA's work into this new chapter. She's a licensed professional counselor therapist and brings much experience to MBA from a variety of settings. Most recently, she served as the Thrive Wellness Coordinator for Candler School of Theology, Office of Student Life, and as the Contextual Education Intern for Spelman College Sisters Chapel. She has a Master's of Divinity degree from Emory University and a Master of Science in Art Therapy and Counseling from Eastern Virginia Medical School. Her bachelor's degree is in Women and Gender Studies from the University of Virginia with a minor in African and African American Studies. Jocelyn currently lives in Atlanta, Georgia, which I'm so excited about. Welcome, Jocelyn. A word of deep gratitude for all of our speakers and participants today. I know we will be reflecting on these conversations for days to come. As I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar serves as one of several events that MBA has planned to honor and celebrate Mark's 10 years of service and leadership with MBA. In so many ways, this conversation offered you a glimpse at the kinds of skills, insights, and care that Mark brings to his executive role, not only with MBA, yet also across the life of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. We invite you to honor Mark's 10 years of leadership with a gift to the MBA Mark D. Anderson Fund. And in partnership with the Christian Church Foundation, the Anderson Fund will strengthen the work of MBA as the earnings from the fund will go to support the overall MBA mission. You can find the link to give to this special named fund in the chat box. We thank you. We heart you, Mark, and we give thanks each day for all that you bring to MBA. In the coming weeks, do look out for videos, virtual meet and greets, and a virtual toast and roast for Mark's 10 years taking place on August 12th, 2021. Thank you for your time today. Go back to our website where this webinar will be posted along with resources for you to have what you need as we all journey forward in these days. Please reach out to us with any questions, and we hope to see you again for the next events. Thank you so much. Have a great one.